Hello my bookish friends out there in booktube land, welcome to another episode of Tristan and the Classics. As promised, I am here with an in-depth book review of Crime and Punishment by Fyodor Dostoevsky. And once again I apologise for the cover. Still can't work out what the art department was thinking about with this cover. Anyway, let's dig in, shall we? Just before we start, if you're new to this channel, here we are all about classic literature, both contemporary, back to 19th century, and all the way back to the classics of the Greeks and the Romans. But we as a community, amongst all the comments, like to dig deep into the books and extract the marrow from the bones, as it were, to get right into the midst of them and work out what deeper message they're trying to convey. So let's carry on, shall we? Crime and Punishment. It's not one of the behemoths of Russian literature. This book itself is 460 pages long. But like a fine sauce on a Michelin-rated plate of food, this is reduced in its flavour. It's intense. There's many a subplot going on, lots of interacting lives crisscross one another, not to mention the whole plot of Raskolnikov himself, the hero of the book. But there's almost not a page that's wasted. Dostoevsky just crams the book full of meaning, and it's a very intense experience to read. On my first reading of this book, it instantly went into my top 10 books that I've ever read. Just a word of caution before I do the plot summary, this video will contain spoilers because it goes in depth. However, before you race away, it doesn't mean to say you shouldn't listen to a review even if you haven't read the book. Sometimes having an in-depth review and a discussion of some of the ideas within a book can actually help you approach the story yourself with a greater grasp of what's going on and sort of helps you to develop your own thoughts around that. However, if you don't want the spoilers, I understand, but save this video and come back because you won't regret it. The plot of the story centres on Raskolnikov. He's a student in the University of St. Petersburg. I say student, he's actually left the university for the time being because he's got no money. And we first find him in this fourth-storey garret, which is practically the size of a coffin, we're told later on in the book. And he's completely depressed and morose. But the idea is that Raskolnikov wants to do the world a bit of good, but he needs money. And he's been playing over this idea in his mind that he could kill this old hag of a pawnbroker, steal her money, finish his education, and then give out lots of the wealth and all the good things he'll then do to benefit the poor and help others who deserve it. And so he goes ahead and he murders this pawnbroker. Now, when he goes to kill her, he thinks that her simple sister is out of the house. But after killing the woman, the sister, her name's Lizaveta, she comes back and he kills her too. And he makes his escape, only just missed by people coming up the stairs. He hides in a room where there were painters, and when everyone's passed, he leaves. But then Raskolnikov has to deal with the fallout of his actions. He has the pangs of conscience. He's troubled and suspicious that everyone knows he's the criminal. So when he's asked to go to the police station, because of course he had lent things to the pawnbroker, so they've got a record of people who left things there, he thinks they're immediately going to find him out. And of course this weighs on his mind. However, after committing the crime, we start to feel for Raskolnikov because he's not just an out-and-out barbarous murderer. He comes across a man called Marmeladov, who, I'm probably not saying that right, but he's a drunk who, because of his poorness and because of the unfairness of society, he's got hooked on alcohol and he drinks away his family's money, and his wife's going out of her mind. He's going to leave little children to be destitute if he dies. And what happens is his older daughter, Sophia, who's also called Sonia, she's forced to take up prostitution in order to help feed her younger siblings and her mother. And yeah, it's really grim, and you feel for all these different people that he comes across in society are so downtrodden and beaten. Also in the book, there's another story going on, and that is Raskolnikov's sister Dunya. She and her mother are going to come to St. Petersburg. Now, it's because she's going to marry someone who's richer. His name's Luzhin. And the reason she's marrying him is not out of love. Raskolnikov knows this. She says to her brother, it's because I love him. But really, it's because she wants money to help Raskolnikov carry on in his studies. So she's really sacrificing herself. And Raskolnikov, in some respects, sees that as no better than prostitution. She's getting married in order to get money. And so he wants to put an end to that. So although he wants to hand himself in a lot of the time, he's also torn about doing good for others as well. And eventually it comes to a head and he hands himself in, and that is the end of the book. And what an ending. There is an epilogue, and I understand why Dostoevsky put the epilogue in. However, as a purely literary piece, I think the book would be better without it. And I think I follow the mainstream opinion there. However, I do get why he put in the epilogue. So that's what the book's about roughly, and it's really, really good. Yet despite being a really good yarn, which you can just read it for the story, it's very, very good. As a classic work, it goes far deeper than just the story. One of the things that I believe makes a classic piece of literature is that it goes beyond story to either making a social commentary or working on a hypothesis. So an idea that the author's come up with and is beginning to explore. And Crime and Punishment certainly does explore a hypothesis. What is it? Well, we have to have an idea of what Raskolnikov himself believes, because it's going to be based on that that Dostoevsky starts exploring some ideas, some philosophical trends that were going on in the day. Don't let that put you off, by the way, thinking, oh, philosophy is not for me. Believe me, when we talk philosophy, we're talking about current ideas and ways of thinking and worldviews that influence the way humans act. And you will find that what he explores here is very, very much alive and kicking today. A very good reason why classic literature should be taught at schools, because most youngsters have never heard this and they think that the system of things they're in now and the ideas that are coming up are new. They're not. And this is a case in point reading this book. So let's get down to what Raskolnikov himself believes. Raskolnikov, in essence, believes in the idea that there are people in society who are above others, that they are more gifted, more intelligent, more noble. It's the idea of the beneficent Superman, who he's got the power to get to the top. He can step beyond the certain boundaries that everyone else has to make a better world for other people. And this is an essential idea because the word crime in Russian that's used here, I'm not a Russian speaker, I've just researched it. The word crime is not like crime in English where you've just committed a crime. It literally means to cross over or to step beyond something. So to step beyond the legal boundaries of a society, but also the moral and ethical boundaries as well. Raskolnikov is saying that there are some people, and you find them all through history, who they get to their position because they stepped across the ordinary boundaries. And they have statues erected to them, don't they? And they're called great. Whereas if an ordinary person did some of the things they did, they would be called a criminal. And Raskolnikov believes that he's got these great ideas for the benefit of all humankind, which is a bit of a grand thing to claim. And he thinks he just needs money to get going. And he wants to get started in one fell swoop. And by killing this pawnbroker, whom, by the way, he calls of no use. Because she's a horrible, nasty creature, she beats up her simple-minded sister. She sort of leeches off the poor because they have to keep pawning things to her and she makes a tidy profit on them. And yet she just miserly squirrels away all of the money and doesn't even spend it. She wears rags. So he's saying, I could do so much for society if it only takes taking out this one horrid creature, then that should be justified. But this is how he puts it. He frequently refers to Napoleon as being a great man. Look what he says himself. It was like this. I asked myself one day this question. What if Napoleon, for instance, had happened to be in my place, and if he had not had Toulon, nor Egypt, nor the passage of Mont Blanc to begin his career with, but instead of all those picturesque and monumental things, there had simply been some ridiculous old hag, a pawnbroker, who had to be murdered to get money from her trunk, for his career, you understand. Well, would he have brought himself to that if there had been no other means? Wouldn't he have felt a pang at its being so far from monumental and sinful too? If you can hear fizzing, by the way, or hissing, the rain is coming down like crazy out there. Do you get the point of what Raskolnikov's saying? Napoleon, if you think about his actions, he fought and he killed. It says he did Toulon, which made him famous because he helped get rid of the British from there. He went to the campaign in Egypt. However, what's interesting, he abandoned his army in Egypt, and he would later abandon his army in Russia. 500,000 men he would abandon. Yet Napoleon was great. People loved him. He was held in high esteem and was able to rule for the benefit of France to make its glory, even though he stepped past the legal boundaries of his day. Even though he may actually have passed the ethical and moral boundaries. Actually, that's unquestionable that he did. And so Raskolnikov is saying this. There are some people who are naturally great, and they have the right to step over the line of societal boundaries. And he's just asking, if instead of Toulon and getting rid of the British, the rise of Napoleon for the benefit of France had just taken the killing of an old pawnbroker, would he have done it? Or would he not, because it's not monumental? So Raskolnikov is justifying this position. What we would call this, essentially, he's talking about Übermensch, or Superman. And obviously there's a hideous knock-on from Übermensch, which means you've got Untermensch, or subhumans. Now some say this thing in this book is just not realistic. It's sort of a hyperbolic argument that Dostoevsky is going to embark upon. However, I will say this. These thoughts did carry to the 20th century, and we only have to look at Nazi Germany to see the Übermensch and the Untermensch. And the Soviet Union following. There were those who were considered on the side of the state, and there were those who were considered the deplorables, as it were. So this idea that Dostoevsky is going to explore, this vein of thought that Raskolnikov's got, is actually a genuine idea. And Dostoevsky is putting it under a microscope. Now, what you will find in this book is he does not set up a straw man. He doesn't make Raskolnikov ridiculous and we all say, oh, he's rubbish. Or he doesn't set up religion and say it's rubbish. He fights well for both sides. He has a very, very reasoned and tight approach where he sets up the best argument for both sides. And that's something that is very much lacking today. If you hear the arguments of either people of different religious persuasions or political persuasions or societal persuasions or economic persuasions, so often now it's simply a case of they are wrong and they're stupid and my idea is right. And often you'll hear the most pitiable interpretations of the opposition's argument in order that they can just knock it down easily. And most things are now fought on emotion and vitriol rather than reason. Dostoevsky does not do that, and that's why this is such a riveting book to get into. It takes a certain kind of mind to write it, and it educates a mind that reads it to think more clearly. Ultimately, using Raskolnikov as the fulcrum, the pivot, what Dostoevsky will do is he will sort of vie two reigning philosophies against each other. And again, don't be put off by the word philosophy. I'm not a philosopher, but it just means a way of thinking, a reasoned process. And what he's looking at is something back then popular amongst the Russian students of the day called rational egoism, and its more sophisticated, much more sophisticated argument of utilitarianism. And that's held up against the old order of things, Christianity primarily, is what's being put up, because this is going to be an argument over morality more than anything else, and law. So what is rational egoism? Very simply put, it is the idea that we all do things primarily for ourselves, and to do something that is not primarily of benefit to oneself is irrational. That the serving of oneself and the pleasuring of oneself should be the supreme concern of every individual, and that altruism, as in out and out altruism, is basically a mental disorder. It's something you should steer very clear from. So that's rational egoism. Now, you get a character in the book who espouses this idea, and he's a very, very dislikable man. He's the one that wants to marry Raskolnikov's sister. His name's Luzhin, or Peter Petrovich, I think is his other name that he's called by. He says Christianity is useless because it says if I've got a good coat and I see a beggar who hasn't got one, I should rip my coat in half and we can both be cold together. He says with economic progress, with us going out looking for ourselves and benefiting ourselves and making ourselves rich, overall there'll be more coats to go around, and it will benefit everyone overall because we'll all be improving our standards. So this is an idea of economical progress. Now, Raskolnikov and his friend, who we'll come to in a minute, his name's Razumihin, if I've pronounced that correctly. All you Russians out there will be laughing your socks off at me, but it's the best I can do, I'm afraid. Razumihin, he also takes objection with this idea, the rational egoism. Raskolnikov, he belongs to more the utilitarian, materialistic, rationalistic category of people. The way utilitarianism works, in very basic terms, because like I say, I'm no philosopher, is on the pleasure-pain principle. You have to weigh pleasure against pain to find what is right. What maximizes pleasure is good, and what maximizes pain isn't good. And of course, the vice versa is true as well. You could apply that to the individual, but better still, if the government and those in authority were to weigh up what was best for society, what brings the most amount of benefit, the most amount of pleasure, would be by default the best thing, and what minimizes the pain and discomfort of society would be the best thing. And so that's how you get your standards in society. That's ultimately utilitarianism. This is butted up against Christianity. Now, of course, Christianity works on a totally different principle. For instance, altruism is a good thing. Christ died for all men, that all men might live. So he did something purely against his own interests for the benefit of others. And Christianity, of course, is founded on absolutes. So there is right and there is wrong. It's not about pleasure, pain. There is right standards and wrong standards, and God decides those. Now, Raskolnikov has a problem with this, mainly because, as you see a lot of the characters, for instance, Sophia, who is very religious and reads her Bible, and yet where's God? Because she ends up in prostitution. Marmlyadov is addicted to her father, is addicted to drink, and his whole family is suffering. And when he passes away, he's got starving children, and there are beggars in the street, and other prostitutes who are ill-treated, and wicked men rampant. Where is God in all of this? And Raskolnikov paints that picture very, very clearly. And in one situation, he's talking to Sophia, and he says, the only answer is we have to break what is unbroken and take the suffering on ourselves. So in other words, we need to break free from the past ideals, because where is God? And we need to just own the suffering ourselves, and we need to sort it out through this principle that some greater men could go to the top. They can cross the boundaries of morality as long as it's for the benefit of all society. And that's what he holds to, and he has a strong argument for that as well. And that's fundamentally the push you are going to find in this book through the character. It's not overt. It doesn't come across like a philosophical treatise in any way, shape or form. But as you read it, look out for these ideas. There is a pushing of the two ideas against each other as Dostoevsky weighs up the pros and cons of each. Now, taking a look carefully at Raskolnikov's own view, here's the question. Did Raskolnikov do anything wrong by his own standards in killing the pawnbroker woman? You see, she was a horrid person. There's a little scene earlier on where he overhears two people talking, and they're mentioning this old woman and that how much better it would be if she was out of the way and her money was used to help others, because she's such a waste of space. I think I've mentioned before, Raskolnikov says she is of no use to society. That is a classic utilitarian expression. One of the things that weighs up whether something is good or bad in the utilitarian doctrine is it useful to everyone or not? And to show that this idea that Raskolnikov has is not just pure evil, but is actually based on a sound idea, a principle in his mind, is that after the murder he finds this poor family, Sophia and Marmeladov and all the kids, and he wants to help them. He really goes out of his way to help them. Interestingly, he doesn't keep the money that he steals, he buries it under a rock, which is because of his anguish and torment over what's actually happened and whether he's going to be caught. And he feels guilt, but then again he's saying I shouldn't feel guilty because what I've done fits my theory. If I take it to its logical conclusion, taking that money to help myself grow to a position where I can help others is a good thing. Later, much later, he's talking to his sister Dunya, and she says something to him. She says, but you have spilled blood, when he's confessed to her. What he says in return is very enlightening. In chapter 7 of part 3 of the book, she says, brother, brother, what are you saying? Why, you have shed blood. And Raskolnikov says, which all men shed, he put in almost frantically, which flows and has always flowed in streams, which is spilt like champagne, and for which men are crowned in the capital, and are called afterwards benefactors of mankind. Look into it more carefully and understand it. I too wanted to do good to men, and would have done hundreds, thousands of good deeds to make up for that one piece of stupidity. Not stupidity, even clumsiness. For the idea was by no means stupid, as it seems now that it has failed. Everything seems stupid when it fails. Do you see his reasoning? In the course of history, people who rise to the top, Alexander the Great, shed a lot of blood by conquering his enemies and making an empire. Julius Caesar did the same. Napoleon, who Raskolnikov holds as a good example of someone who is above the ordinary affairs of men and can step beyond the crime, can step beyond the boundaries of society. He ordered a massacre in Paris. He was ruthless. And Raskolnikov is saying, so I shed blood. But blood has been spilled through all history for the benefit of mankind at the end of it. So why shouldn't I have done this? Of course, Dunya is different. She holds to the Christian ethic. And we'll talk about her very soon. I just want to read one sentence, which is somewhat terrifying, and I want you to think about today. Okay? There's a police officer, investigator called Porphyry, and he has read an intellectual paper that Raskolnikov wrote at university. It's one of his treatises, his theories, which says that there are some who are above the normal order of things, and that there might be collateral. Just an aside, it's interesting about collateral. When Raskolnikov kills the old woman, her simple-minded and good sister comes into the room because he's left the door open, and he sees her and kills her too. Now, she had done nothing wrong, but it was necessary for him to kill her because she was a witness. What's really odd in the book, or not odd perhaps, quite deliberate, is that the whole idea that's going around in Raskolnikov's mind is to do with murdering the old woman, and there's no remorse felt for Lizaveta, who is the sister. It's almost like saying collateral is to be expected on this rise to the top, but it's okay because it will overall do a benefit to the majority. Now, this theory of his about the Übermensch, the Superman, the man who's above the normal restrictions of society, He's written this thesis, and the inspector is talking to him, said, "Oh, I've read that." And he just makes a straightforward observation. What literary or scientific man does not begin by some originality of conduct? And the reason he says this is he's saying, "Oh, I'm not objecting to what you wrote at all, Mr. Raskolnikov. What scientific or literary man doesn't start with something out of the ordinary, an original idea? This idea that someone has the right to even kill if it advances the benefit of many." Now think about today. How many people, because of education and being brainy, literary or scientific, think that that qualifies them to determine what is ethically right and wrong in a society today? There's many who would like a scientocracy now. Isn't it interesting that that idea is not new? That there are some people who can judge what is right and wrong, and they may bring in unusual ideas, but we have to explore them. So nothing new under the sun. Do you see the benefit of reading classic literature? Let's move on to something very, very curious and delicious, really, when it comes to exploring in a book. And if you're going to read Crime and Punishment at any point and you're watching this, make a note of this right now. There are 3 characters in particular around Raskolnikov's life whose names sort of place them in a way to explain or explore Dostoevsky's hypothesis about the vying philosophies going on. One is this young prostitute who's very religious. Her name is Sophia. Now, Sophia, it means wise, and she's devoted to sort of the Christian ethic, godly way of life. And something I picked up from another excellent video that I'm going to put the link in down below in the description is from a booktuber called Sophia Clef. I think I'm pronouncing your name correctly, Sophia. Forgive me if I'm not. She is currently on her channel doing a series of reviews on Crime and Punishment in which she looks at the meaning of Russian names. She speaks Russian, unlike me. Looking at the symbolism of colours. She goes into depth more about the dreams that Raskolnikov has, which have a serious impact on the book. I've just got to focus on one area to keep this short enough. So really go over and check out her videos. They are excellent. Now, it was in Sophia's video that she says when Raskolnikov first sees Sophia, she's got a red feather in her hair. Saint Sophia, who is the mother of faith and hope and charity, I believe in the Eastern Orthodox Church, is often portrayed in red, even with red wings, hence the red feather. So there's a clever bit of symbology that's going on there in Crime and Punishment. Now, Sophia stands for almost the angelic nature of Raskolnikov, because she stands for just right and wrong, self-sacrifice, even if it means taking pain on yourself. Remember, she's become a prostitute to help her family. She's been wronged rather than do wrong. Raskolnikov has done wrong because he thinks it will bring good. And there's this curious scene where both of them are talking, and it just mentions that there they were standing, a murderer and a harlot. Now the question there is, where is God in all of this? But what's very unusual is that the moment you see them doing this, Sophia, she has hope because of her standards, despite committing a wrong. And yet Raskolnikov is in despair despite what, according to his philosophy, his way of thinking, is right. That's a very strange contradiction, and Dostoevsky seems to be pushing this point, that the utilitarian, the rational egoism idea, if you take it to its end conclusion, is wrong. It cannot work. It leads to bloodletting. And whoever Raskolnikov himself says, there is only freedom and power, but most of all power. If you set up this approach of what is the most pain or what is the most pleasure, and you weigh things according to this, then whoever is in charge gets to decide what's right and wrong. And of course, that will always be arbitrary. Or even if you're trying to measure it by some algorithm scientifically, you can't know all the imponderables, and so you can never get to making the absolutely perfect decisions. Whereas Christianity does have absolute, this is right and this is wrong. Of course, that can be abused by those who commandeer God for their own good. But what Dostoevsky is saying is one's got a more grounded ethical base. It's not mobile or fluid. So that's Sophia, and she becomes this angel. So watch for that when you're reading about her. She appeals to his self-sacrificing side, to his compassionate side. Then there's a guy called Svydrigilov, and he's an absolute baddie. He's almost the devil on the other shoulder. Svydrigilov, it appears his name, and this is what you want to take down, it seems to be drawn from a battle fought in the past in which I think it was the Golden Horde, so pagans, beat the Christian forces. So he symbolizes the anti-Christian perspective, the philosophical rationalism of his day. Now, Svydrigilov, while he's atrocious, what Dostoevsky is doing is he's challenging you as a reader because you will dislike him as much as Raskolnikov dislikes him, because Raskolnikov hates him, although he's strangely drawn to him. You are challenged by Dostoevsky to say, well, what is wrong with what Svydrigilov's doing? Because it's the natural conclusion to come to if pleasure for oneself is the highest aim and the minimizing of pain for oneself. Because Svydrigilov, Dunya has worked for him in the past in the countryside, and he tried to seduce her. And it was Svydrigilov's wife that got her away. His wife has died, and we pretty much are left with the impression that Svydrigilov murdered her, and he's come to St. Petersburg and he wants to find Dunya again. He actually corners her at one point, and he's going to rape her. And she pulls out a pistol, and he says, oh, okay, you're going to send me to America. America means to die. It's a place with no soul. Dostoevsky and a lot of Russian ideals back then were that America was economically brilliant, but it had no soul. So you're going to send me to oblivion, to America. And she shoots at him and misses. And then she's loaded again, and she decides, he says, go on, take another shot. And she just shoots to miss. And he says, really? You can't love me, but you won't even kill me? And at this point, he says to her quickly, grab the key and get out of here before I change my mind. In other words, he's letting her go, but he knows very quickly his idea will come back to assaulting her for his own pleasure. Do you get that? It's his own pleasure. What's so interesting about Svydrigilov at this point is he's in absolute torment, turmoil, he's a bad character, and he lets someone go. If he was going to die in the next few minutes, because he does kill himself, can you hear the rain? Why should he not indulge in the criminal activity of rape for his own pleasure before he kills himself? Now, it's anathema to us, we rebel, but Dostoevsky is saying, well, according to his standards of right and wrong, in fact, utilitarianism, why can't he? And it's interesting that after a life like his, when he knows he's going to kill himself, he does the self-sacrificing thing and lets Dunya go, but he also leaves his money to look after Marmeladov, remember this drunken man we met earlier, he leaves the money for his children to be educated. So right at the end, Svydrigilov realizes there's more in giving than there is in taking. So that's two names. There's a third name, Razumihin. Razumihin? I don't know the pronunciation properly. He is Raskolnikov's friend, and his name means reason, or something akin to reason. And what's so good about Razumihin is he actually does sort of take an in-between role. He's an intellectual, he comes from the universities himself, he understands the need for reforms in society, but he doesn't throw the baby out with the bathwater. He understands the Christian ethic as well, because he's very giving to Raskolnikov. He's always looking after him. So these three characters are really good to see in action, because by means of them, Dostoevsky sort of examines and balances all of Raskolnikov's personality. It's brilliant. So I would really suggest you take notice of those three names when you go into the book. How does Raskolnikov end up confessing or coming to his conclusion? It's mainly through Sophia. He confesses to her first. Svydrigilov overhears and wants to use that for his own benefit, so this angel and demon kind of effect. But Sophia, she keeps appealing to Raskolnikov to turn to God, and he struggles with that. But what he can see is Sophia and Dunya, they were prepared to be wronged, but not do what is wicked back. Whereas Svydrigilov was prepared to take anything for his own benefit, and Raskolnikov, even with the best of intents, had to choose to do something wrong first. And most of his actual psychological torment is not about necessarily being caught, although that really does weigh on his mind a lot. But he's tussling with this idea that, but what I've done isn't wrong, because this would benefit a majority of people. So why do I feel tormented? And it takes him a long time to come around. It's interesting that towards the end, there's a little conversation between Raskolnikov and Sophia, and he says, do you love me? And she says yes. Even though she knows he's committed a crime, she's going to stick with him when he goes to prison. And he says, will you always love me? And then the sentence is said, he said this without weighing his words. And I love that little sentence, without weighing his words. Instead of the clinical, theoretical, methodological approach of intellectuals, we can work out everything that is right and wrong, some equation for everything. Human beings are not like that. There is an instinctive nature to right and wrong, that if you look through all cultures in history, you will notice that they're there. So the intellectual elite, sometimes they miss the most things, and you need to not try weighing everything. That is not how to get the right society. So in other words, not through a pure science elitism, a literary elitism, a philosophical elitism. You can't do it that way. And eventually he confesses, and the book should end there and leave you to do the rest. However, Dostoevsky does bring in an epilogue, and there's a phenomenal dream in the epilogue, and it shows you what Dostoevsky is getting at with the book. Raskolnikov is struggling to let go of his theories. He still senses they're right in many respects. And for the first part of his incarceration, he's this sullen, morose character that no one likes. Eventually, though, he comes to a realization, and that realization is expressed through a dream. And in this dream, he sees a future in which every individual person thinks themselves one of Raskolnikov's supermen. That they are scientifically enlightened, that they are philosophically developed, that they are some way out of the ordinary. And of course the world is in pandemonium, because if everyone overstepped the boundaries and the lines, you'd have a complete mess. So he finally takes the theory to the end level and finds it wanting, and then he can let go. And he returns to Sophia when he's finally let out. So that's how the story goes. What Dostoevsky brilliantly does in all of this is he takes the theories of the radicals of the day and he takes it to the end conclusion, the inevitable conclusion. And one of those inevitable conclusions, when Raskolnikov's worried about suffering, taking on suffering or death, he says, well, why should I even be worried about that? Why should I worry about suffering? Take it to its end conclusion. I should just be either serving myself totally, or I should just kill myself, because it's all oblivion anyway. There's a comment again made by Raskolnikov of himself. He says, is the only reason I'm alive out of cowardice or fear of death? Because if we're going to die and come to nothing anyway, well, what a bleak existence we have. We may as well just die straight off. But I'm too scared to kill myself. I'm afraid of death. That's the only motivation for living. If you take hard reality, right and wrong, and remember Sophia, it means wisdom. She's not smart as an intellectual, but she's smart emotionally, instinctively. But Saint Sophia, mother of hope. Humans need hope. One thing utilitarianism does is removes hope. Ultimately, these radical ideas built up to make the socialism revolution, which changed the USSR, but of course it created the United Soviet Socialist Republics, which anyone who was viewed as not with the state, or even suspected that they might not be with the state, was removed, because they were not going to add to the pleasure or to the benefit of the regime, and hence they should be removed from the regime, if not killed, at least sent to Siberia. So Dostoevsky was very far ahead of his time. And of course, a lot of these ideas are around today. And a lot of people think it's new, that it hasn't been done before. But it has. Both sides have been done before. So that was my review of Crime and Punishment. I hope that this gives you a full flavour of the book. I've only looked at one part of it. There is so much. Like I said, go over to Sophia's YouTube channel, which I'll link. Being a Russian speaker, she can add a great deal of insight to your understanding of this book. But I hope what I've given you will help you as you go through the book, or will help you make a bigger sense of it now that you've read it. Let me know what you think in the comments. And if you like classics and love going in depth in the classics, be sure to subscribe to this channel so that you never miss any more episodes from Tristan and the Classics. I wish you the greatest joy in your reading.